Good evening, everyone. As you are joining, we will just take a few moments to make sure that everybody gets into the room and we will get started. And just as an advisory, we are recording this meeting today. So if you are more comfortable having your video off, that is absolutely fine. However, we would love to see your beautiful faces. It's so wonderful that all of you are joining us today. We're so grateful to have you here. I know that I've had lots of discussions about this film already, just off under the radar, and people are really responding very powerfully to it. So I'm have you all here so we can have this discussion today. I know we're going to be looking forward to a really, really rich discussion this evening. So it looks like our waiting room has emptied out. Let's go ahead and get started. And I wanted to welcome everyone to our United States film discussion here. If you hear some whimpering behind me, there is a dog here who really wants to contribute to the discussion. So we're excited to have her here as well. Our partners in this program this evening are the Kansas City Public Library, Consensus KC, and American Public Square at Jewel. I am Kim Guile. I am the Community Reference Manager at the Kansas City Public Library, and I also happen to be a board member with Consensus. I'll also be one of the facilitators for the conversation. So I just wanted to make sure that we thanked every single one of our sponsors. We are all playing a unique role, and we are grateful for you being here. And we also wanted to give a special welcome to Greg Orman, who is a cast member in this fantastic film. And he is also a former independent candidate for the Senate and for governor in the state of Kansas. So welcome, Greg. And to kick it off, Heidi and Jenny Garman and I are going to ask you some questions. And I'm going to stop my screen share here, and then we're going to pop over to our questions. So Heidi, do you want to kick us off as the Executive Director of Consensus KC?
I would love to. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. As Kim mentioned, we are super excited to have this opportunity and hope that you got a chance to screen the film beforehand. I did put it in the chat window, so I'm just going to do one bit of maintenance, which is that live transcription is available. So if that's something you would like, please click on more at the bottom of your screen and enable it for yourself. So Greg, as Kim mentioned, we are so honored to have you here with us tonight. And we wanted to know, just to start, how did you end up in the film? How did you get involved? How did this get started, and why did you say yes?
Sure. Well, happy to be here. I'm a fan of all three organizations who are sponsoring it, and in fact, I'm on the board of the American Public Square as well. So nice to be with you all tonight. You know, documentaries happen, I think, probably the same way most things happen in life. It's just sort of, you know, you get introduced to someone who has a vision for a documentary. In this case, Ben Rickey came to me, having been referred to me by Mark Gerzon, who is also in the film. Mark is someone that I have had a longstanding relationship with, and actually, the last time I had spoken to Mark face to face, prior to him asking me to be in this documentary along with Ben, was at an event at the Kansas City Public Library. So the public library had an event for Mark's book, The Reunited States of America. And after that event, Mark and I went and had a drink and talked a little bit about the future. And he brought up this idea of this gentleman doing a documentary and asked me if I wanted to be a part of it. And, you know, I talked to Ben Rickey, and there's a certain level of trust that you have to have with the filmmaker. Because you realize you're giving them access to everything that's happening. You know, most of the time when the filmmakers are there, you're hot mic'd. So, you know, anything you say can end up in the film or otherwise later be released for whatever purposes. But I trusted that what Ben wanted to do was create a film that really demonstrated alternatives to the current partisan warfare that we have in this country, that seems to pit neighbor against neighbor, and, you know, ultimately is not leading to solving problems for the American people. And so, after spending some time with him and getting comfortable that we were aligned around vision and what he was trying to accomplish, I sort of thought nothing ventured, nothing gained, and invited them to really embed themselves with our campaign.
That's amazing. And for those of you who are monitoring the chat, I just put a link to the recording of the program that you just mentioned, Greg, that we did with the Kansas City Public Library. And I'll also drop into the chat a link to the book, just in case anybody wants to read it. It is totally fantastic. So Greg, you have run for office at least twice, to my knowledge, in 2014 and 2018. And what guidance do you have for people who would like to run for office? What do you say to people who try to get into office and then don't get into office? And then would you comment on what changed between the 2014 run and the 2018 run?
Well, lots of questions there. I actually have run for office twice before, 3 times if you count the 1986 effort to become my school student council president. But public office, yes, twice. Look, at the end of the day, if you're going to run for public office, I always tell people, you better passionately feel like it's something that you need to do. And you need to do it because you believe that you have something to offer. I tell people public service isn't supposed to be the best job you're ever going to have. By definition, if it were, it wouldn't be public service. So you really need to feel motivated to help improve people's lives and have sort of a clear vision for how to do it. When I ran for the US Senate in 2014, I was concerned that we were sending the worst of both parties to Washington, bitter partisans who seemed to care more about pleasing extremists and special interests than they did about solving problems. And I was concerned that if we didn't get our country back into the business of solving problems, our standard of living, our status in the world, and the very existence of the middle class in America was at risk. And so I tell people, if you don't feel that passion, if it's not something that you really feel like you need to do because you want to improve other people's lives, don't do it. And, I'll give you actually 2 examples of conversations that I had. One was I had a conversation with a candidate who was running for the US Senate in 2014 in Kansas and trying to persuade me not to run. And I was considering it at the time, but I thought, look, I'll meet with this candidate. And if he persuades me that he is the right person to do it, look, I'd rather play golf than be in a position where I'm, beating my head against the wall because I'm not getting anything done. And so I said to him, why are you thinking about running? And his answer to me was, well, because I think I can win. And I said, well, that's not really an answer. Everybody's sort of got to make that calculation before they run. But I said, what is motivating you to run? And he said, well, my opponent's a -60 in the polls. And I said, well, actually, no, he's not. He's a -11. And at the time I thought about it and I said, Vladimir Putin isn't even a -60 in America. Now, after what happened in 2016, et cetera, his approval rating actually improved in the United States. But I said to him, look, here's the reason I'm thinking about running. And I said to him effectively what I just said to you. And he said to me, well, 3 issues, jobs, job creation, and the tax code. First thing I said was, well, how are jobs and job creation different? Unless one is about the former CEO of Apple Computer and the other was about these things that people do to earn money. And then we got later in the conversation, I said, I've heard you're a pretty good attorney. Have you thought about running for attorney general? And he said, why would I do that? It's a pay cut. And right there, I knew this person is not going to inspire anybody. He's not going to inspire people to vote for him. And if you believe this is something you need to do personally, you should do it. And so that's why I decided to run in 2014. I had another conversation with someone who thought of himself his whole life as being a United States senator and finally retired from his job, had a lot of financial freedom and flexibility. I invited him to a couple of Centrist Project meetings that we were having, and the Centrist Project was supporting candidates and tried to help him think through this issue. And he called me and he said, I've thought about it. I've talked to my wife. And I really don't think this is going to improve our lives. You know, today we control our own schedule. We go where we want, when we want. I said, stop, time out. If you think this is about improving your life, don't do it. This is about improving other people's lives. So when people are thinking about running for office, I ask them that very question: why do you want to run for office? And if there isn't some burning, passionate reason that connects to improving people's lives, I tell them, spare us all, you know, don't do it. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people get into politics because there is some level of personal advancement or career advancement to it. And that's unfortunate, you know, because I've often said that public service without courage quickly becomes self-service. And unfortunately, if you're in it for yourself, you don't act courageously. You know, you don't make decisions that might be in the best interest of your constituents in the long run, but might make you vulnerable to losing your election in the short run. And this sort of goes back, you know, when I was a kid, I tell people I came by politics honestly. My maternal grandfather was actually Hubert Humphrey's top aide for 25 years. And so, you know, I've sort of had it in my family for a long time, in my blood. I went to Boys State and then Boys Nation, and I was elected president of Boys Nation. I met Ronald Reagan in the White House. I came back and I said to my dad, you know, look, I think I might want to get into politics someday. And he looked at me and he said, why don't you skip the internship and go straight into crime? And that was my dad's perspective on politics and politicians. But after I stopped laughing, he actually had a serious point. He said, you know, look, someday you may decide to run for office. And he said, if you do that, that's great. But put yourself in a financial position first where you can afford to lose an election. Because if you can't afford to lose, you will do anything to keep the job. And at the end of the day, my dad always felt your health and your integrity were the only two things that matter. And if you lost one of them, you know, that was a problem. And so, you know, that was how I took my approach to politics. That's why I didn't go into it right away. It's why I started in the private sector, building businesses, you know, creating companies, jobs and opportunities for people, was largely because of that conversation I had with my father when I was 17 years old. You asked another question in there, and I apologize. It's, you know, reporters do this when they ask you 3 questions at once. They, you know, they want to see what you're going to gravitate to.
I apologize for doing that to you. So the last part of the question was, what changed between the way that you ran in 2014 versus 2018?
Well, so if we go back to 2014, as I suggested to you, I was considering running in 2014, but really my considering running in 2014 was driven by a strategy that we had worked on in 2013 called the Senate Fulcrum Strategy. And it was our belief that if we could get enough independents elected to the US Senate that neither party had a majority, that we could use that leverage, our ability to determine who the majority leader was, who held the chairman's gavels, to get Washington back into the business of solving problems for the American people. And so we did polling in 17 states, and it turned out there were 7 of those states where it was feasible for an independent to potentially run and win. And we started recruiting candidates, and we couldn't get anybody to run as an independent. Everybody was afraid of running as an independent. They thought, you know, gee, I've got friends, that my friends will disown me because my friends are all either Democrats or all Republicans. I won't be able to raise the money. There are all these institutional barriers. And so in June, you know, I sort of decided, you know, if you really believe in this, you know, you've got to suit up and run yourself. And so that was really what I would call, while I was thinking about it in early 2014, it really wasn't until 5 months before the election that we decided to run. And so that was an election where we were really just focused on what was in front of us. The first question was, how do we get on the ballot? You know, we had to travel the state of Kansas and get 11,000 signatures to get on the ballot. Technically, we only needed 5,000, but everybody who had done signature gathering had told us, you know, the Secretary of State's going to throw out at least 30% of your ballots, your signatures, so you got to get more. You know, so everything was sort of happened in rapid order. You know, once we got on the ballot, you know, I traveled the state, did a bus tour, and ultimately we were rising in the polls and got to the point where we were in second place. And that's really when that race changed, because when the Democrat dropped out of that race, it allowed the Republicans to really paint me as the Democrat. And so we saw in our polling that I went from almost a plus 25. I was a plus 24 in the polls, meaning 24% more people, percentile more people liked me than disliked me. By the time of the election day, I was a plus 1, because they basically spent $17 million telling people that a vote for Greg is a vote for Harry Reid. And that was the whole message. In fact, in our debates, after the Chamber of Commerce debate, I shook Pat Roberts' hand and I said to him, we had a bet in my office as to how many times you would say Harry Reid in this debate. I said the over-under was 28, and I think the over won. But we counted it. He actually said it 34 times in that debate. So, that race got a lot of national media attention. In 2018, when I thought about running, we really, we didn't have the element of surprise anymore. Ultimately, the Kansas City Star, I think anybody who followed the race realized they started before I even announced I was running with the Greg is going to spoil the race argument, which was an article that they made sure got written about once every 6 to 8 weeks during that race. And so it was a different race in that it was, we were basically really running against both parties. Ultimately we got in right around the time of the primary when Kobach was ultimately declared the winner on the Republican side. We were at 19% in our internal polls. Laura was at 32, Chris was at 38. And we knew at that time that given how objectionable Chris Kobach was, a lot of people sort of equated him with Trump, that we weren't going to make up that 13-point gap we had with Laura to be the alternative to Chris. And so in mid-September, while I continued campaigning, we pulled all our ads down. And ultimately, I stayed in the campaign for a range of reasons, but we knew at that point that the race was really over. So different races, in that regard as well. We never quite broke through what I call the gravitational pull in 2018 that we clearly broke through in 2014.
Yeah, our next question is going to be from Jenny Garman, who is the Kansas City Public Library's Legal and Government Information Specialist. Jenny?
Hi, everybody. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. It's wonderful to be with you. And thank you very much, Greg, for everything you've shared so far. I'm going to come to you with a practical question about civic engagement. And I'm going to be using the recent rejection of funding for the Medicaid expansion in Missouri as sort of the point. What can we do as citizens when we do not feel represented by our elected officials?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in fact, what I would argue is that's an issue for the majority of voters in the majority of districts. So if you look at where the majority of voters are ideologically, generally speaking, the person who gets elected in any given district is generally speaking significantly more ideologically extreme than the median voter is in that district. So it's something that happens quite a bit. One of the things that we're working on through a couple of organizations, one is the Institute for Political Innovation, one is Unite America, is changing the way elections are run so that the people who ultimately get elected are far more representative of their median voter. And one of the big initiatives in that regard was actually passed in Alaska last cycle, which is their top 4 primary with the ranked choice voting general election. So in Alaska, they've basically gotten rid of party primaries. Everybody runs in one primary. And then the top 4 vote getters go on to the general election, where a ranked choice system is used to determine who gets elected. And if you think about the impact of that, think about Lisa Murkowski. Lisa has a competitive re-election coming up in 2022, and yet she did something that very few Republicans did. She voted to convict President Trump in the second impeachment trial. And I would argue Lisa did that because she felt liberated to do it because she no longer had to run through a Republican primary. And so she could do what she thought the average voter in Alaska would want her to do and what she thought was right, instead of saying, what is this more narrow sliver of voters who tend to be more extreme on the right want, which is the question she'd have to ask if she were running through a Republican primary. And so those sorts of reforms are now being worked on in a dozen states through citizen-driven initiatives. You know, there's some legislative activity, but I tell people when you're looking for political reform, it's often very hard to do it if you require the consent of the victims. So if the people whose power is being taken away, the people who are elected by a particular system are being asked to change that system, they're awfully reluctant to do it. And so, you know, there are 26 states in the United States that allow citizen-driven initiatives. And in a number of those states, they're pursuing political reforms that they believe will ultimately lead to elected officials who more accurately represent the median voter in their district. And a lot of people are concerned that that means we're going to be a nation of centrists. The reality is the way the country is sorted ideologically, we're still going to have very conservative representatives from certain districts. We're still going to have very liberal representatives from certain districts. But ultimately, they'll be much closer aligned to the median voter in their district, which I think is really what the idea of representation is about. By the way, what Missouri has experienced is not a unique experience to Missouri. South Dakota, as an example, about 4 years ago, through a citizen-driven initiative, passed a whole series of ethics reforms. So in South Dakota, it was legally permissible to put $100,000 in cash in a duffel bag and hand it to your legislator. They passed ethics reforms that changed that. The first thing the legislature did when they returned was repeal the ethics reforms. Day one. In Maine, where they passed ranked choice voting, the first thing the Republicans and the Democrats did was come together to try to repeal it. And so they ultimately ended up repealing a portion of it, which required the voters of Maine to do another signature drive through what they call the people's veto, and ultimately veto the behavior of the legislature that just overturned a reform that the voters voted on through an initiative. And so this idea of the political class behaving in a way to protect the system that protects their perks and privileges is something that we see consistent, and they rely heavily on the American people being time pressed, you know, having short memories, having their own issues that they need to deal with. And so they think by the time the election rolls around, they'll forget that we did this. And it's troubling. I mean, it's sort of deeply troubling.
So we've just got to thank you for that. That was, I think that you brought up some really great points. And I think that's brought up some questions in the audience too. So I'm just going to read a couple of the ones from the chat window in our last 5 minutes with you. So the first is, would requiring all citizens to vote make a difference for centrist candidates? It seems that the most extreme voters are more fired up to get to the polls. Well,
they certainly are in primary elections. You know, there's no question primary elections are where extreme voters sort of have the most control. And, you know, in 90% of the congressional districts in America, as an example, they're not swing districts. You know, they're R+5 or more, D+5 or more, so that the likelihood that the candidate who wins the primary is going to win the general election is very high in 90% of the districts. And that's in large part because the primary system sort of amplifies the voices of those most extreme voters. As it relates to if everybody voted, would we end up with more centrist candidates? That's actually a very interesting question. You know, and candidly, I haven't done the work or the data work to be able to sort of figure out whether or not that would lead to different outcomes. Certainly what we've seen is independent voters vote in lower numbers as a percentage of the population than as a percentage of their population than Democrats and Republicans. And so it certainly would increase the participation of independent voters, probably increase the participation of voters who are frustrated with both sides and have sort of opted out. And, I wouldn't be, intuitively, I'm not opposed to an idea like that. I tell people, politics isn't like a bad restaurant. If you don't vote, it's not going to end up putting the system you dislike out of business. Whereas if you don't go to a bad restaurant, enough people choose not to go to a bad restaurant, well, that restaurant's going to go out of business. In some cases, both parties really work actively to encourage you not to vote. And I know the idea is that, Republicans are working against some of the more expansive voter reforms in HR 1. There's no question about that. They're sort of empirically in numbers coming out against that. But the reality is negative campaigning is about voter suppression, and both parties do it. When they run an ad, when someone runs an ad saying, this person I'm running against is the worst possible version of a human being you can imagine, the goal, one of the primary goals of that is to suppress votes, because they know the other side's going to run that same ad. They just want to make sure that only only their voters go out to vote. And so it's one of the reasons independents have opted out and don't vote in nearly as many numbers, is they're so disgusted with both sides that they choose not to vote. So again, I'm not intuitively opposed to an idea like that. I just haven't run the numbers to figure out how it would impact who gets elected.
Thanks, Greg. We have another question coming in. What glimmer of hope can you offer in the face of the political class behaving in the way that you had just described? And I will say we also have a caution that has come in from the audience saying they're uncomfortable with labels being used here, particularly the word extreme. So if you'd like to keep that in mind when you're responding.
Yeah. So the first question was?
The first question is what glimmer of hope?
It's interesting. If you watch the movie, the Reunited States, and you watched the story of Stephen Alakari and the Millennial Action Project, one of the things that really gives me hope is how millennial voters seem to behave and how they seem to be behaving. They tend to be far less partisan. They tend to be far less wedded to parties, wedded to institutions, far more focused on just frankly solving problems. And I think there is a glimmer of hope in that generation. They are also now the largest group of eligible voters. And so, we saw Gallup's recent polling that came out last month that now 50% of Americans self-identify as politically independent. So they're rejecting the labels of both sides. And ultimately, millennials have been above 50% for quite some time now. And so for me, the glimmer of hope comes in millennials. There's also another glimmer of hope in that there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes in political reform. And I've been involved in political reform going back to 2010. And what I can tell you is over the last 10 years, the quality of people involved, the resources behind political reform have gone up by orders of magnitude. And so when we see things like the Alaska initiative going through last cycle, when I look at the dozen states or so that are going to try to put in some form of open primaries with a ranked choice voting general election, I think we are going to start seeing successes and we are going to get to a tipping point. And if you look back at history, there's historical precedents for this. So if you look at the progressive era, we passed 3 constitutional amendments during the progressive era. And a lot of those were based on reforms that happened at the state level, most notably women's suffrage. Women's suffrage happened first at the state level in many states before Congress ultimately acted to put that question to the states and make it a constitutional amendment. We saw the direct election of US senators during that period of time. You know, there's lots of state-based reforms that happened that then predated a national movement and ultimately ended up leading to significant national reforms. And Olympia Snow probably said this best when she said, you know, we are at a time of monumental consequences for our nation. We have lost the art of legislating at a time of monumental consequences for our nation. But then she put it to the people, this was in her farewell address, and said the change has to happen from outside of Washington, D.C. She said, it is not going to happen here. You have to lead outside of Washington, D.C. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing it again in these reforms that are starting to pass. And if you look at it, the vast majority of Americans, whether you're deeply conservative, deeply liberal, the vast majority of Americans agree with the statement that Washington is a rigged game that only benefits those people who can buy access to power. And it's tapping into that belief that the system is fundamentally corrupt that I think can be used to ultimately reform the system.
Thanks for that, Greg. I know that we said that we can have you until 6:30 and it's 6:32. And I also want to make sure that we are mindful of the time to make sure that we get to all of the things that we wanted to discuss as a group. So Heidi, I will defer to you as far as how you would like to redirect us.
Sure. So I want to thank you all for joining us, and especially Greg for that powerful message that you just shared with us, and for your role in the film, and for joining us here tonight. We're really honored by your presence. What we are going.
It's my pleasure to be here. And if I knew how to answer a question in under 7 minutes, we might have been able to get to more. So I apologize.
No, I feel like an hour and a half, we could spend an entire day discussing all of this. And we hope that that a lot of these same questions, as I just put in the chat window, that people are asking are things that could be questions that we discuss in our small group discussions when we break it into the breakout rooms. So Greg, you are welcome to hang out, or I know you've got children you got to put to bed too. So we're really grateful for your time here this evening.
Yeah, you know, and what I might do is try to answer a few of the questions that are in the chat by typing some responses to them, and then
that would be wonderful.
Jump off. So if the chat's going to stay up, I'll answer a few of those, and then and allow you to get on with your program.
That sounds great. So what we are going to do next is move into breakout rooms for the next 45 minutes or so. And when we move into breakout rooms, we will be with a facilitator in each room. So we would ask when we go into the breakout rooms that you do turn on your camera if you're comfortable. Those will not be recorded. We did record the large group session so that we could share that panel or that discussion with Greg on our Facebook and on our website, and make that available for folks that weren't able to be here tonight. But the breakout room discussions will not be videotaped. We will be in those breakout room discussions for about 45 minutes. They are centered on the film. If you did not have a chance to watch the film beforehand, that's okay. You can still view the film through tomorrow using our special viewing access page that you should have gotten an email about. If you sign into Eventbrite, you can find that information if you did not receive it in your email box. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to go over our agreements for the small group discussions, and then Ashley will split us up into our small groups. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. I'm going to put the rules of engagement, sort of we're in a living room conversation. We're sharing a living room right here. And so this is pretty much the rules of the living room. And we start with taking money off the table. We're not here to try to change anybody's mind. We're here for a conversation. Listening first is very important. And the whole idea is to truly be curious about, well, maybe I'm going to hear something different that I hadn't thought of before, that I disagree with, but let me make sure that I'm listening. Showing respect is something I think we all understand. And also, so in this moment that we're together, just suspending judgment and really truly, again, having that reminder to listen. this whole idea of paying attention to context, what people are talking about, finding the common ground, finding what we can agree on, but also appreciating that we have different ways of looking at things and different ways of approaching solutions. Embracing vulnerability, if anybody knows, remembers Brene Brown, that's how we really get to know each other. That's really how we get to understand each other, is just saying, hey, I'm going to bring my whole self to this conversation, not going to hold anything back. Just so you are welcome here. You're welcome here. Be purposeful and to the point. We do have some time together, but we're going to try to keep it, make sure everybody has a chance to talk. So just to be aware sometimes if you ramble, like I'm rambling right now. And then let me just see right here. Own and guide the conversation really just means we all have a part to play in it. That we would be, personally responsible for what we have to say, and that if we notice that we're kind of going on a bit much, we really want to say, oh, let me stop right there and give you a chance to talk. And that's actually the end of the rules. So let's go ahead and break up into our rooms, and I look forward to seeing you in there.
So we spent a fair amount of time talking about the concept of fear and whether or not people feel fearful and act accordingly based on that fear. Because when we talked about our own feelings of fear and experiences of fear, not everyone in our group really felt fearful. And so you end up having this larger conversation of, where's that coming from and how does that influence how you talk with other people and what you agree on what the facts are. So it was a really fabulous conversation. And I think the next steps for this group was, do we want to be fearful? Have we transitioned from fear to anger, or have we transitioned from fear to anger to hope?
I'm happy to go in next. I loved my group. Oh, thank you so much. I don't know where the time went, but I wanted to pull out a few of the things that we talked about. As we started the opening, it was that politics has become a replacement for sports and entertainment, in terms of people are feeling free to be on the sidelines and scream and yell and then go home. Not being, and we're all talking about how being a citizen requires being educated and being engaged, being involved. And also the idea that things have shifted so much in how we share, how we learn about what's going on in the world, that we've really shifted from a news report to commentary, to almost, and it's difficult for some people to understand. You're not hearing news anymore, you're hearing commentary. One thing I really wanted to put a big star by this is that it helps to have shared terms of reference, that if we're going to have a conversation, that, well, what do you mean by extreme, for example? What do you mean by privilege? And when you say this, what do you mean? So that you almost have a glossary where you're like, okay, I'm going to go check and see what that looks like. Our discussion about values was fascinating to me, because we were talking about things like freedom being a charged word, and equity, that equity is something that not all Americans share that value. Not everybody believes that everybody should have that. They treat it more like a zero-sum game. If I give you something, that takes away from me, not realizing how we're stronger together. I also really wanted to share the next steps. Keep having conversations. That's how we're going to move things forward, that we have to stay open-minded and be willing to listen. And just before we were leaving, one of my folks was saying, when you're engaging in those conversations, you have to realize that some people are going to be like that man with the foot on his neck that was referenced at the end of the movie, where not everybody is going to see you as really wanting to help, but that you're just in their space. Also, finding out more about the organizations that supported the documentary and what's going on there. So I'm gonna, and I love this one, reaching out and inviting people who are less like you and learning their stories and sharing your stories, having that conversation like that too.
Thank you for that, Jenny.
Well, I'm happy to share. Oh,
Go for it.
Okay. I also love my group. That's so great. We talked a lot about kind of what's the commonality here. And one of the things that was brought up was the idea of family, that everyone can kind of relate to wanting to protect and care for their family. But what does that look like when we're trying to reach across the aisle? And that this was actually kind of, I think, not a criticism, but just something that they were hoping for from the film, was to find out more about what those next steps might be. Feeling like the film was more like, here's the opportunity, we can come together, but wanting to hear more about what that actually looks like. And Heidi, I of course plugged our Weaving Community Conversations and Consensus KC as an opportunities to connect with people, but recognizing still that, you know, a lot of times the diversity of thought and political views isn't as much as we'd hope for to be able to make those different types of connections. And then there was this idea that to host some other community conversations to really break down kind of slow, intentional conversations around kind of similarly, like we were saying, Jenny, like, what is freedom? You know, having everyone kind of identify what that means to them, again, to search for those commonalities, to kind of hopefully zero in on all of those things that people have in common. And I think that's it. Rebecca was my co-facilitator, and I hope I'm being a good representative of the group. You guys are all sharing great things, so.
Yes, thank you, Erin.
And we are starting to run out of time, but if there are any other groups that want to share, I'm putting in the chat window what my group discussed. Food, family, and movies, similar to some of the other ones, as ways that we can connect. And we talked a lot about hard relationships as well that can be there. Any other facilitators want to share back before we go into resources and next steps?
I would share one more thing, if that's okay.
Sure.
And that is just another one of the comments was that when you have a relationship with someone who believes differently than you do, who comes from a different political frame of mind, that this person tries to think of people she dearly loves who think differently than she does, so that she makes sure to see them with that frame of reference, see them as a person.
Thank you for that. So I know we've just got a couple of minutes left, and Brandon, I see you're throwing some resources in the chat window. If you can hold off on those, we will be sending a follow-up email to everyone with additional organizations, links, helpful resources to folks that you might find interesting after the event. I'll get that out tomorrow. But we do want to invite you to a couple of upcoming events. First, Kim put the link to the survey for tonight's event in the chat window, and I'll stick it back up there. If you did not have a chance to watch the film before tonight, you can still watch it through tomorrow, and that link is there. And then on May 18th, Consensus KC and the Kansas City Library will be gathering for a deliberative discussion on how we can rebuild our economy. And I know a lot of the groups talked about how this film might have been different if it was made today versus when it was made. So this guide and this deliberation that we will be doing on May 18th is updated. It is taking into account all of the events of 2020. So space is limited for that deliberative discussion. We would love to have you join us. We did put the link in the chat window. I want to thank you from Consensus, the Kansas City Public Library, and American Public Square for joining us here tonight for this event. Kim, would you like to add anything before we sign off?
Just all of the happy, warm, lovey feels. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate the opportunity to meet people, especially in this time that we are separated through social distance and whatnot. It's really nice to be able to meet folks. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. And as a closing, I will say, if you are burning with wanting to talk about this more, on Thursday at noon, every Thursday at noon, we hold Consensus KC and the Kansas City Public Library host Weaving Community Chats. And I will post the link right now in the chat window to those. If you register for that once, you can come any week that you would like to. And we tackle some of these big issues, like the policy issues in society in those chats. So thank you again for coming tonight. As Kim said, all the happy, warm feels, and facilitators, if you are able to stick on for just a couple of minutes, we would really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. Great job as usual.